Okay, so today we're diving deep into Starlink. This project is so ambitious, it's kind of hard to grasp the scale of it. We're talking thousands of satellites all over Earth working together to give us internet access. We've got a ton of sources to go through today, articles, news reports, we've even got technical documents, all to help us really understand what Starlink is, how this system works, the issues surrounding it, the controversies, and what it could mean for the future of, well, everything.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about Starlink is that it's not just about technology, it's this convergence of trends. I mean, we're talking about this huge demand for global connectivity, but also like the decreasing cost of spaceflight thanks to companies like SpaceX and this greater ambition to push technology past Earth.
Yeah, it really does feel like something straight out of science fiction. But it's happening right now. Over 1 million subscribers are already using Starlink. And that number is going to explode as they launch even more satellites. They're aiming for almost 12,000 in orbit. So how does the system work? I mean, it can't be as simple as pointing my Wi-Fi router at the sky, right?
Not quite, haha. While the idea itself is simple satellites relaying internet signals, the tech behind it is actually pretty complex. We're not talking about big, clunky satellite dishes. Starlink uses a three-part system. So first you have the satellites themselves, constantly orbiting and talking to each other. What sets Starlink apart is that these satellites are in low Earth orbit, so much closer than typical communication satellites. And that means lower latency, which is really important for stuff like gaming and video calls.
So no more laggy Zoom meetings. I'm sold already. But how does the signal get from the satellite to my device?
That's where the second part comes in, the user terminals. These aren't like the old satellite dishes you might be picturing. They use phased array technology. Basically, they can electronically steer the signal to follow the satellites overhead. No need to adjust anything. These terminals, which you'd install at your home or business, they communicate directly with the satellites passing by. And then the last part of the system is the ground stations. These are placed strategically around the world, and they act as the link between the Starlink network and the rest of the internet.
So the data goes up to a satellite, bounces to a few others, beams down to a ground station, and then boom, I'm online.
Exactly. And this idea of mega constellations with thousands of satellites all connected, this didn't just appear out of nowhere. The roots of this go back decades. There were early attempts at building commercial internet constellations like Teledesic in the 90s.
Wow, interesting. So what's different now? Why is Starlink working when those earlier projects didn't?
The biggest factor is the cost of launches. Companies like SpaceX have reusable rockets, and their manufacturing process for the Starlink satellites is super streamlined. So they've really brought down the cost of getting to space. But it's still a hugely expensive thing to do. SpaceX thinks the total cost of Starlink will be at least $10 billion.
$10 billion. That's an incredible amount of money. What does that say about their business plan? How are they planning to get that money back?
That's the big question. The projections for revenue are pretty ambitious. Reports say they made $1.4 billion in 2022, but they were still operating at a loss. But projections for 2024 suggest revenue could hit $7.7 billion and then climb to $11.8 billion in 2025.
So it sounds like Starlink is betting on huge growth, probably targeting new markets in areas like maritime and aviation where regular internet is limited. But their plans to help connect rural areas in the U.S. hit a roadblock recently.
Oh, you're talking about the FCC subsidy being revoked? Yeah, they were supposed to get a lot of money to help expand broadband in the U.S., but the FCC decided Starlink hadn't shown that they could actually deliver the service they promised.
Exactly. It's a big problem for their plans in the U.S. What does that decision mean for their strategy?
Yeah.
Can they still make a difference in connecting those underserved areas without that funding?
It's definitely a challenge. SpaceX is appealing the decision. They're saying the FCC changed the rules after they met the original requirements. But if that appeal fails, it raises some big questions. Can they offer affordable internet to rural areas in the U.S. without that money? They might have to change their pricing or find other sources of funding.
So while connecting rural areas in the U.S. faces these hurdles, Starlink is making a big impact in other areas, pushing the boundaries of how and where we can get online. And it's not just about bringing Netflix to people, right? We're talking about applications that could completely change entire industries.
Absolutely. Starlink goes way beyond residential internet. We're seeing them doing a lot in maritime and aviation. Companies like Royal Caribbean and Hawaiian Airlines are already using Starlink to offer high-speed internet on cruise ships and airplanes.
That's incredible. Imagine being able to work remotely or stream movies or even video chat while you're on a plane. It would be a total game changer for travel, especially long flights.
Yeah, it's a great example of how Starlink is disrupting those industries. But it goes even further into areas that raise some serious questions about national security and the future of war.
You're talking about Starlink's military applications.
Mhm.
We've seen reports of it being used in Ukraine, providing essential communications for their military operations. How has this technology changed the way wars are fought? And what does this mean for the future of warfare?
It's a situation that's changing fast. Starlink's ability to provide strong communications, even in areas where the regular infrastructure is down. It's been incredibly useful in the conflict. It's allowed Ukrainian forces to stay connected, coordinate their operations, and even control drones.
It's fascinating,
Mhm.
but also kind of scary. This technology that was made to connect people can also be used in war.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about the potential for escalation.
Oh, absolutely. Russia has said they see Starlink as a military target, and that shows how vulnerable things in space are becoming. And that conflict could extend beyond Earth.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought. And it brings up another question. The ethical considerations of a company like SpaceX having this powerful technology. They even created Starshield, which is specifically for government and military applications.
Yeah, that's a big development. It raises questions about accountability and transparency and what their goals are. I mean, their first contract is with the U.S. Space Force, which shows how blurred the lines are becoming between private companies and the military in space.
Okay, so we have thousands of satellites providing high-speed internet, changing industries, connecting remote areas, and even playing a role in wars. But let's step back for a minute. Launching that much stuff into space has to have some unintended consequences, right?
You're right to be concerned about that. The sheer scale of Starlink has gotten a lot of people worried, especially astronomers.
Yeah, I can imagine astronomers being concerned about light pollution from all those satellites. It must interfere with their observations of the night sky.
It's a big problem. Back in 2019, the Cerro Tololo Inter-American Observatory in Chile, they took pictures of a Starlink satellite train moving across the sky, and it left these bright streaks that disrupted their work. It was a pretty stark reminder of how these mega constellations could affect astronomical research.
I've seen those images. They're pretty striking. It seems ironic that this technology made to connect us could make it harder to study the universe. What's being done to reduce this light pollution? SpaceX has mentioned darker coatings and sunshades for the satellites. But is that enough to address the concerns of astronomers?
It's an ongoing issue, and a point of disagreement between SpaceX and astronomers. SpaceX has taken some steps to reduce the problem, like those sunshades to stop sunlight reflecting off the satellites. But astronomers say that's not enough, especially as Starlink deploys these newer, bigger satellites that are even brighter.
So it seems like we have this classic situation of technology advancing faster than we can understand and manage the consequences. And it's not just light pollution, is it? There's also the problem of space debris and the risk of collisions in Earth's orbit.
Exactly. The more things we launch into space, the greater the chance of collisions.
Right.
And that could create what's called Kessler syndrome, like a chain reaction in space. One collision creates a bunch of debris, then those pieces hit other things. And suddenly you have this cascade of destruction that could make entire orbits unusable for generations. It's a serious issue, especially with companies like SpaceX launching thousands of satellites.
It's a scary thought that our desire for progress could accidentally ruin our future in space.
It really is. And it shows how important it is to plan carefully, to have global cooperation, and to think about the long-term effects when it comes to space.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into Starlink. We've talked about the technology, the goals, and some of the problems, but we've only scratched the surface.
There's so much more to discuss.
In the next part, we'll dive deeper into the ethical issues, the effects on geopolitics, and the potential long-term impact of this game-changing technology. So stay with us.
Welcome back to our deep dive on Starlink. Before we move on, I think we should talk a bit more about those concerns about space debris and Kessler syndrome.
Yeah, that really stuck with me from our last conversation. It's pretty scary to think that trying to be more connected could make space too dangerous to use.
It's not something that's going to happen right away, but it's something we need to keep in mind. I mean, even a small piece of debris flying at thousands of miles an hour, it could completely destroy a satellite, even a spacecraft.
Right.
And the more stuff we put in orbit, the more likely those collisions become.
It's like we're walking this tightrope between innovation and potential disaster.
Yeah, in a way. But SpaceX has designed the Starlink satellites to deorbit, so at the end of their life, they're supposed to automatically re-enter the atmosphere and burn up, so they shouldn't add to the space junk problem.
Okay, that's good to hear. But are those deorbiting systems foolproof? I mean, what happens if a satellite breaks down and can't deorbit?
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
No system is perfect, and there's always the chance something could go wrong. That's why it's so important to have international cooperation and good space traffic management. We need everyone working together to track objects in space, to know when collisions might happen, and figure out how to prevent them.
Like air traffic control, but for space.
Yeah, exactly. And space agencies and industry leaders around the world are working on that. But let's change gears for a bit and talk about the benefits of Starlink, especially how it can connect places that are really isolated and don't have internet access.
Right, that's a big part of what Starlink is all about. It's a pretty inspiring idea. Imagine bringing high-speed internet to places that have never had it. Remote villages, disaster areas, even research stations in the middle of nowhere. What kind of impact could that have on those communities?
Oh, the possibilities are huge. Access to information and communication can be really transformative. It can open up access to education, healthcare, economic opportunities, and just connecting with people, things that were out of reach before.
Yeah, it's a powerful argument. But I do wonder about unintended consequences.
Oh.
Connecting people doesn't solve every problem. We also need to think about the social and economic issues that create the digital divide in the first place. So will Starlink really empower these communities? Or could it create new forms of dependency?
You're right, that's really important. It shows that we need to think about this holistically. Technology can be a powerful force for good, but it's not a magic solution. We need to make sure that when people get access to technology, it comes with investments in education, infrastructure, and economic development. That's how you really bridge the digital divide and empower communities.
It's complicated for sure, and it's something we should think carefully about. But let's talk about another area where Starlink is having a big impact, the travel industry. You mentioned that cruise lines and airlines are using Starlink more and more to offer high-speed internet to passengers. How is that changing the travel experience?
It's a big change. Imagine being able to work remotely or stay in touch with friends and family or even stream movies and play games, all while you're on a cruise or flying across the world. It opens up a ton of possibilities for travelers. It can make those long journeys much more productive and enjoyable.
It sounds like a dream for digital nomads or anyone who needs to be online while they're traveling. But what about the technical side of things? How do they make sure there's reliable internet in the middle of the ocean or at 30,000 feet?
Well, that's where the low Earth orbit of the Starlink satellites comes in. Because they're closer to Earth than those traditional geostationary satellites, the latency is much lower, and the signal is stronger, so you get faster data speeds and a more reliable connection, even in tough environments.
It's interesting how this tech is blurring the lines between being connected and disconnected. It seems like we're moving towards a world where you can get online almost anywhere, even in places that used to be totally off the grid. But it also raises questions about digital overload and the need to find balance in our lives.
You've hit on an important point. As technology becomes a bigger part of our lives, it's crucial to figure out how to manage our relationship with it and make sure it's working for us, not the other way around. But we shouldn't forget about the potential this technology has to change industries, to make things more efficient and create new opportunities.
Definitely. And one of the most interesting examples is how Starlink could change industries that work in really remote and challenging environments, like agriculture, mining, energy exploration, and scientific research. How is Starlink changing the game in those areas?
Imagine a farmer out in the middle of nowhere, and they're using sensors and drones to check on their crops, to make sure they're watering them the right way, and even control their equipment remotely, all thanks to a reliable internet connection from Starlink. Or think about scientists in Antarctica. They can get real-time data, talk to colleagues all over the world, even run experiments remotely, all because they have a stable internet connection.
It's amazing to think about Starlink bringing the power of the internet to places that were limited before. It's like opening up a whole new world of possibilities.
It is. And it's not just about being more efficient or productive. Sometimes it's about safety, even survival. Think about disaster relief after a natural disaster in a remote area. Starlink can provide vital communications, so rescuers can coordinate their efforts, talk to victims, and get important information.
That's a great example of how this technology can be used for good, connecting people when they need it most, and giving them a lifeline when the normal infrastructure is down. But we can't forget about Starlink's even bigger ambitions. Remember we talked about MarsLink? That idea of creating a network like Starlink around Mars, is that just a sci-fi fantasy?
Right.
Or could we really have internet access on Mars one day?
It might sound crazy, but it's becoming more and more realistic. As SpaceX and other groups work on sending humans to Mars, they're going to need a reliable way to communicate. Imagine scientists on Mars sending back data, video, even live streaming what they're doing. Or think about future Martian colonists staying in touch with their loved ones back on Earth.
It's incredible to think about.
Yeah.
But let's bring it back down to Earth for a minute and talk about Starlink's plans for mobile phone service. They're working with T-Mobile to build a system that would let phones connect directly to Starlink satellites, so you could have mobile coverage anywhere in the world. Is this the end of cell phone dead zones? Will we be able to make calls from the top of Mount Everest?
It's a bold idea, and it could change everything about mobile communication. Imagine being able to stay connected no matter where you are. Even in the most remote places, it would be huge for travelers, adventurers, researchers, anyone who needs to be connected when there's no regular cell service.
It's pretty exciting. But I'm sure there are some big technical challenges to figure out. Can our current phones even talk to satellites? And how will they deal with limited bandwidth and make sure calls are clear?
That's where the innovation comes in. T-Mobile and SpaceX are working on a system where 4G and 5G phones could connect directly to Starlink satellites. You wouldn't need any special equipment. They're also looking at how to manage the bandwidth and make sure voice calls are prioritized, so the calls will be clear.
It sounds like they're really pushing the limits of mobile technology. But what about all the regulations? Getting approval from every country for a satellite phone network seems really tough.
It definitely is. They'll have to deal with a ton of international regulations, figure out how to share the radio spectrum and get all the necessary licenses, and they'll have to address concerns about security, privacy, and making sure the technology isn't misused.
It reminds us that even with these amazing technological breakthroughs, there are always real-world challenges to deal with. But if they can make this work, it could be a game changer. It would connect people in ways we haven't even thought of yet.
It's a vision worth working towards. But as we keep exploring the possibilities of this technology, we have to be aware of the potential downsides, the unintended consequences, and the importance of using it responsibly.
You're absolutely right. It's a complex issue with both incredible potential and serious challenges. And it's a conversation we need to keep having as this technology changes and shapes our world. Welcome back to our deep dive into Starlink. We've explored the technology, the ambitions, the challenges, and the potential impact of this ambitious project. It's clear that Starlink is pushing the boundaries of what's possible, connecting us in ways we never thought possible, but it also raises some pretty big questions about our future.
Yeah, it does. And as we wrap up this discussion, I think it's important to come back to those ethical questions surrounding this technology. It's not just about the technical stuff, it's about power, access, and control.
Right. We've touched on the space debris issue and the potential for it to be used by the military, but there's also that question of who really benefits from this technology. Is Starlink truly a way to connect the entire world? Or could it actually make existing inequalities even worse?
It's tough to say for sure. On the one hand, Starlink could help bridge the digital divide and bring internet access to those communities that have been left behind, the ones that haven't been able to participate in the digital economy. But on the other hand, there's this risk that it could mostly benefit those who are already connected, which would just make the gap between the have and have-nots even wider.
It's like that classic dilemma with new technology. It has the potential for both good and bad. So how do we make sure a technology like Starlink is used for good so that it benefits everyone, not just a select few?
Well, it takes careful thought, proactive policies, and a constant conversation. We have to deal with the issues of affordability, accessibility, and digital literacy to make sure everyone has an equal chance to benefit from this technology. And we need to have clear ethical guidelines and regulations in place to prevent misuse and make sure this powerful tool is used responsibly.
It sounds like we're going to need a whole new set of rules for digital ethics, one that takes into account the specific challenges and opportunities that come with space-based technologies like Starlink. And this brings us to another big topic, the changing role of private companies in space.
It's a pretty interesting shift. For a long time, space exploration was mainly done by government agencies like NASA and Roscosmos. But now we're seeing companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin taking on a much bigger role, not just launching satellites, but actually shaping the future of how we use and explore space.
And that raises some questions, right, about who has the power, the role of government regulations, and the potential for commercial interests to influence what happens in space.
Right. It does. And it really highlights the need for strong international cooperation and legal agreements to make sure space stays a peaceful and sustainable environment for everyone. We need clear rules for how to behave in space, rules that address space debris, radio interference, and the possibility of using space for military purposes.
It seems like we're entering a new era of space governance,
Right.
where we need to rethink our old ideas and adapt to a rapidly changing situation. And it's not just about laws and regulations, it's about developing a shared sense of responsibility and a common vision for the future of space.
Absolutely. We need to move past just thinking about our own national interests and adopt a more global perspective. We need to recognize that space is a resource we all share and that it belongs to all of humanity. And we need to have open and honest conversations involving not just governments and companies, but also scientists, ethicists, and the public.
It's a call for a more inclusive and participatory approach to space exploration, one that recognizes how interconnected our actions are and the long-term effects of the choices we make. As we wrap up this deep dive into Starlink, I think we need to remember that this is just the start of the story. The technologies we've talked about are still evolving, and we're only just beginning to see their impact on our world.
It's a time of great excitement and uncertainty. There's so much potential, but there are also big risks. The decisions we make now will shape the future of space exploration for many years to come.
So as we keep pushing the limits of what's possible in space and technology, let's do it with a sense of wonder, collaboration, and a commitment to making sure these advancements benefit everyone.
That's a challenge worth fighting for.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Starlink. We hope it's made you curious, given you new information, and maybe even inspired you to keep exploring the amazing connection between space, technology, and the future of our world. That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.